So good evening everyone and welcome to the School of Port's live session. My name is Isabel Monteiro and I'm an export manager. I've been working with Port for over 7 years now. Today I'll be conducting this session to which Charles Symington will be joining in a couple of minutes. School of Port is a new platform that aims to educate wine professionals and wine lovers about port wine in a relaxed and engaging way. Well, Charles doesn't need much by the way of an introduction, but still, he's a fourth-generation winemaker and head of winemaking at Symington Family Estates. He is responsible for some of the finest ports produced in the last quarter century, such as the Dow's 2011 vintage port. I'll be interviewing Charles to understand how port winemaking practices have changed over the years in the Douro. This session will last approximately 25 minutes, depending on how many questions you have. Please feel free to post your comments and suggestions or questions during the session. We'll try to keep up with them and answer at the end. And without any further ado, let's ask Charles to join us. And we're waiting. Let's see. Hi, Charles.
Hi Isabel, how are you? All well?
All good, and you?
Yeah, very well, very well. Here in the sample room. Yeah,
It's always a good place to be.
absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time to join us in discussing the evolution of winemaking in the Douro. I have a few questions for you, but feel free to just give us your impression and your feeling on any of these subjects. The first thing that I'm quite curious to ask you is, you have been working in port winemaking for 25 years now. And I'm sure that being born into a family of winemakers certainly helps. But what do you think are the most important skill sets that a winemaker needs to possess?
Well, there's many different aspects of winemaking. There's the technical side, and clearly, having a course in enology when I started was an important aspect. But there's only so much you really learn at university in terms of winemaking. And I was very fortunate, as you say, being in a family of winemakers, and my father had been working as a winemaker, worked for nearly 40 years or more actually as a winemaker. So I understudied my father for many years, and that was obviously crucial to understanding what is also a very specific area, which is making port, which is not the same as making table wine. And therefore, again, something you don't really learn that much about at university. And so I was very fortunate to have had, to have been able to understudy my career. And so that's very important, particularly from the point of view of looking at how, aging of wines, because wines that we're starting to age now can be aging for 20 or 30 years, and understanding, from the start what type of wines will actually be able to carry out that length of aging is only something really that you can learn from other people who've had the experience in the past. So that was a very important aspect to it. In terms of what has changed as well over 25 years, I mean, there's mainly, I think the big changes in port making have actually been mainly in the vineyard. And we've spent, the last 25 to 30 years perfecting our plantations, the way we plant, where we plant, and learning about our varieties, which up until really the 1980s, nearly all vineyards in the Douro were planted in field blends. And so when I started, there was already quite a lot of monovarietal plantings, but we were still learning about the varieties more specifically. And so it's been a massive learning curve over the last 30 years in the vineyard. And I've grown with that. So I know the vineyards like the back of my hand. And that's really one of the key aspects to really, getting the best out of your vineyards is knowing them well, knowing where the potential is, how much you can expect from different plots, and how they will react or not to weather conditions, and really getting the best out of them. But there's many sides to winemaking, and it's not a pure science, it's an art. and a style that you bring to it, and that is also something. On the one hand, I've learned with my father, but on the other hand, obviously I have my own likes in that respect, and that's what you bring into it. I think the other thing really has been a general philosophy of continual improvement in winemaking. That we as a company and a family have always looked to innovate, to improve, and always striving to do things better, and actually based on good solid knowledge. And so doing research, looking at different options, and then improving on what we're doing based on actual facts, that often based on empirical knowledge. So we've been doing this for about 100 years as a family now, or over 100 years in fact. So there's a lot of empirical knowledge, but we've been grounding a lot of that knowledge in science over the last 30 years.
And if I think about the main advances in winemaking and the main technological advances, I would probably think about the modern treading. How do you think that has contributed and added to how we make port wine nowadays?
Well, I think for us it was a major step forward. The simulating of treading by using machines to tread, as opposed to doing it manually, was a massive step forward. Making a bit of a pun there, but no, I mean basically it was in fact an exceptionally process in itself. I was involved in the actual development of the machines when they were made, and looking at a process that's been used for making wine since Roman times and before, by treading, a solution which for port has been exceptional, and many, or in fact all port was made trodden underfoot until the early 1960s, and then after that, probably most great vintage ports have been made trodden underfoot ever since, or in using new modern treading systems. And the solution we came up with was actually basically using the lagard itself. So making a stainless steel version of the lagard, i.e. a container that's 4 meters by 4 meters wide, and filled to about 80 centimeters with must, creating a surface area of contact between skins and must, which is huge, and allowing us to extract an awful lot of structure and color in a very short period of time. So really our big challenge in port making is being able to extract and structure wines in such a short fermentation time. We have little more than about 48 hours really to achieve wines that will then age for 40 or 50 years or more. And so it is a bit of a challenge, and to achieve that, the lagards and now the modern lagards that we've made have been a massive success. If we think about if it wasn't for that, we would probably be making, I would say, at the best 10% of the wine that we make today using lagards and treading with machines. We'd be making 10% of what we make manually, as it's become almost impossible to find workers to tread, and it would also be prohibitively expensive even if we could. So really, it's been for us. We now use mechanical treading in 4 different wineries, which allows us to produce quite a considerable amount of wine from treading, and a lot of the important wines that we've made in the last 10 years are the result of mechanical treading, like the Dow 2011 and other wines that we've made over the years.
And how do you think that has affected style? I mean, all of these changes that you were mentioning, planting by varietal and using the treading and all sorts of other technological advances that we see happening in the Douro right now. Do you think that has affected the profile of the port that we produced, or of a specific port category?
Well, I think the developments that we've made in port over the last 30 years have really helped quite a lot. In mainly, well, first and foremost, in the consistency of quality, the consistency of being, exceptionally good over the last few years, due to the technology we have in wineries, the way our vineyards are set up, the combination of the knowledge that we've gained over the years. So I think it's fair to say that I don't think port has ever been as good as it is today. I mean, I think at every level we're making really, I think, very, very good wines, and that is largely due to the amount of technology. We also during the time I've worked in the company, we've opened 4 or 5 small wineries. So we have the Vesuvio small winery where we do traditional treading, and then we have the Senhora da Ribeira winery, we have the Canais winery for Coburn, we have the Malverdes winery for Graham, and we have the Bonfim winery for Dow as well, and the Cavadinho winery. All these wineries are very small wineries making absolutely top-level wines. This is something that is, we've invested in over the last 30 years, and these small wineries that produce really our best wines, our vintage ports, our LBVs, things like Six Grapes, and our top wines, and even Coburn Special Reserve. These wines are being produced in these small wines, which allows us to produce wines of a very high quality. Whether in fairness we're making better wines than were made in 1945 or 1963, that is very hard to say. And to be honest, I think they're just such wonderful wines that I think it would be, I don't think it would be fair to say they're better today than they would have been in those. I think that really the big difference is that we are able for certain to make wines of that level, but we're more likely to be able to do that more often because we won't get caught up in certain difficulties that would have happened in wineries and in the vineyard many years ago. So I think port is definitely improved over the years.
Well, I'm sure it has. I mean, we've done such big efforts to try and make port producing and port wine making, easier and more also more accessible to the consumer. One of the things that I always enjoy talking to you about is your experience as a winemaker and your enthusiasm for the Douro, and just hearing you say how much of a special wine region it is. If you had to, because I know you've visited and worked in other wine regions in the world before you joined Symington Family Estates. If you had to choose what makes the Douro so special, what would you pick?
Well, I think really what makes the Douro very, very special is the small yields we have producing incredibly concentrated wines. But I mean, I think it's, as I think I've mentioned to you before, I was fortunate enough to have visited many of the great wine regions of the world before I started working in the Douro, and before I sort of travelled and got to know these different areas, I'd spent most of my childhood in the Douro, and the Douro was a perfectly normal wine region as far as I was concerned, and it was rather a sort of wake-up call after visiting wine regions all over the world. When I got back to the Douro, it became obvious to me just how special it was, because up until I started travelling, I just took it for granted that vineyards were planted on terraces and that it was all very much hard work. And it certainly is everywhere else hard work, but I think in the Douro we certainly have quite a difficult situation in terms of viticulture. I think we're on the extreme. Don't think anybody in their right mind would think of planting vineyards in the Douro today if there wasn't any there. It is quite daunting, really, to imagine that there's 45,000 hectares vineyard planted on mountainsides of the steepness that you see in the Douro. But the challenge is what makes it interesting. It's what makes it sort of really satisfying to be able to achieve what we're doing. And it's varieties. It's the small yields giving fantastic concentration, and it's the uniqueness. I mean, I think the great thing about the Douro is that you're not looking at the same varieties that you find all over the world, which brings about wines, which anybody who loves wines has the opportunity to try something different and change their usual sort of the wines that they would normally be drinking. So it is a great part of the world with all sorts of extremes.
It is also, I mean, I agree. I am lucky enough to visit it frequently during the year. And regardless of how many times I see it, I still find it a place of overwhelming beauty. And I think it's very easy to be passionate about the Douro. And one of the things that we've also witnessed lately is how Touriga Franca and Touriga Nacional, our grape varieties typically from the Douro, are now being planted in other countries around the world. Why do you think that that is happening right now? Do you think it has to do with the conditions that the vine survives in the Douro, as you were saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Nacional and Franca are, they're both called Touriga, but they're really very different varieties. So they do have very different characteristics. There's not many similarities between them, other than the name, to be perfectly honest. So I mean, they're varieties to be used in very different situations, I think. But they are really the mainstay of the Douro today. They are the varieties that are giving rise to the majority of the great wines that are coming out of the Douro. Obviously, there are other varieties, but I think, largely speaking, those two varieties are the key. And I'm not hugely surprised, actually, that they're being adopted in other areas. They're very hardy varieties. They're varieties with very specific characteristics, and they combine together very well. They do have a sort of Cabernet Merlot type sort of combination effect. There's a synergetic effect happening in the blending of these varieties. So. And then they are, they're very resistant to heat, which, as you know, nowadays with the situation of climate change, may be very relevant for some areas. And yeah, so I can't say I'm surprised that they've been adopted elsewhere. Yeah.
And if you had to choose another grape variety besides the Touriga Nacional and the Touriga Franca, what would you choose as one of your favorite grape varieties from the Douro?
Well, we're lucky to have a fantastic selection, actually. So it's not an easy question, but we've been looking at different varieties quite seriously over the last 20 years or so. We've reintroduced two varieties. I think we reintroduced the Suzanne, which was a grape variety that has been used in the Douro for very many years, or really forever. But as a monovarietal, it was a variety that hardly existed in the Douro. We brought that back in, and it's a fantastic variety for bringing freshness and acidity to wines from the Douro, which is pretty relevant if you consider just how hot and how extreme the conditions are in the Douro. And as a blending variety, almost like a salt and pepper, it is actually an exceptionally good variety. We also reintroduced Alicante Boucher, a variety that has been perhaps not so well seen in some wine regions, for instance, in the south of France, because Alicante Boucher is a variety that tends to be overproductive in many regions of the world. But it's a variety due to perhaps the extreme conditions in the Douro, the very low levels of organic material, the Alicante doesn't really produce very large quantities in the Douro, so it produces very concentrated ripe wines. You get away from that more herbaceous style of the Alicante when it produces too much, and it's a variety with extraordinary colour, giving great structure. It's also a very resistant variety to heat, which again is important. It's also a very early ripening variety, so as a winemaker, it's always handy to have varieties that ripen early because the weather can change during the vintage, and in that respect, it's also a form of guarantee to have something pretty good in any year, which is important. We've also we've planted a library of varieties at Quinta do Ati, about 53 different varieties that we planted in an experimental vineyard. So we're recovering of the 100 and so different varieties that exist in the Douro. Very little is known about an awful lot of them, and so we about 6 years ago now planted a varietal planting for experimental purposes of many of the forgotten varieties of the Douro, and we are currently learning an awful lot. It's still very early because you do need to see varieties performing under different conditions over time in different years to understand to what extent the performance is consistent, what difficulties may arise with a lot of damp weather or a lot of heat or so on. So we're still learning, but again, I think we're very fortunate in the Douro to have so much choice, and I think particularly with climate change that we're feeling to a point at the moment, looking at different varieties may be more useful under different weather conditions is also pretty important for the future.
Yeah. And just a curiosity that I have, how have you seen the evolution in irrigation in the Douro?
Well, yes, I see irrigation very positively. I think it's another tool that we have to be able to achieve the highest quality possible in specific years. So whereas irrigation can be a negative if it's used wrongly, bringing about dilution obviously, and not achieving the level of ripeness that would be ideal if it's used excessively. But as a method of reducing hydric stress, which is effectively what we do under very controlled scientific conditions, where we're measuring the transpiration of the plant, we're measuring the amount of water in the soil, and obviously coupled with the amount that we expect that will be produced that year, we are then regulating our irrigation in certain situations. So we don't have irrigation in all our vineyards, but we do have now quite a bit of irrigation, particularly in the Douro Superior, and it is an extremely useful tool. And I think I'm extremely pleased that we've done it. It was something that we thought long and hard about. It's been a very big investment because it's not easy to irrigate vineyards that are located at 100 meters altitude down by the river and up to nearly 400 meters of altitude. So these systems we have are actually quite complex and quite expensive, but the investment, I have no doubt, has been the right decision. I have no doubt that we are making better wines because of it.
Well, thank you. And now, before we finish, I wanted just to play a little game. I'll ask you some short questions and you can only answer one of the two options and you cannot think too much. Ready?
Ready? Come on.
Red or white?
Red.
Nacional or Franca?
Nacional.
Afternoon or evening?
Afternoon.
Summer or winter?
Summer.
Ruby or Tawny?
Ruby.
Age Tawny or vintage?
Vintage.
Simmer Corgo or Douro Superior?
Douro Superior.
Tradicional or modern threading?
Modern.
Douro or Gaia?
Douro.
Yeah. Cats or
Sorry?
cats or dogs?
Dogs. Yeah.
I knew that one. And just as a last question, 1969 or 2011?
2011. Yeah.
Okay, Charles, thank you so much for being here with us. And it's always a pleasure to listen to you. It's always a great learning experience for me. And thank you for taking the time to share some of your knowledge with us today.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all those people listening today. Very much. Bye.
Bye. So everyone, thank you for spending the last half an hour with us. We didn't get the opportunity to answer your questions, but we will. And if you have any other questions or any subjects you'd like to see us cover in the future editions, feel free to send us direct messages. And don't forget to stay tuned at the School of Port for further updates. And as always, brought to you by the Port Med people at Symington Family Estates. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone.